In the summer of 1992, 5 children went for an afternoon swim at Brookview Municipal Pool. Witnesses saw them laughing, splashing, chasing each other across the shallow end. By closing time, their towels were still on the bleachers, but the kids were gone. Police locked down the facility. Search teams drained the pool. Divers checked every pipe, every drain, every inch of the surrounding park. The only door to the locker room was locked from the outside, and no one had a key. For 32 years, the case was a ghost story. Whispered by lifeguards, told in locker rooms, dismissed as urban legend. But last week, during renovations, workers broke through a wall and discovered a hidden staircase, leading to a room no one knew existed. Inside were 5 glass jars, each one with a name, and each one holding the same thing, the one thing that could prove the children never left this building. If you want more true crime stories where decades-old secrets finally surface, make sure you subscribe. May 13th, 2005. Location: Brookview Community Aquatic Center, Brookview, Oregon. The air inside the Brookview Aquatic Center carried a faint sting of chlorine and the sound of muffled splashing from the far end of the lap lanes. It was just after 8 p.m., the Friday evening open swim hours, when the crowds thinned. Lifeguard Katie Pennington was used to these shifts, the quiet ones. The fluorescent lights hummed above, reflecting long, unbroken ribbons of light across the rippling water. She sat perched in her high chair, legs folded beneath her, scanning the pool deck for movement. She counted 7 people total: a father teaching his little boy to kick in the shallow end, 2 teenage girls drifting lazily across lane 4, and the 5 kids from Ridgeway Middle School. They had arrived together, 3 boys, 2 girls, carrying matching black drawstring bags. They were laughing the way kids did when the school day was over and the weekend had just begun. Katie noticed them because they seemed unusually close, like they'd been friends forever. Around 8:15, the group disappeared into the changing room. They didn't re-emerge. Katie didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes kids showered and dawdled before heading back out. But then the father and son left. The 2 girls in lane 4 left. By 8:40, the pool was empty. Except for her. In the locker room, the floor still glistened with freshwater footprints. 5 sets of shoes sat neatly aligned along the wall bench. Above them, 5 open lockers, each with a towel folded on the top shelf. Their bags were gone. So were the kids. The door from the locker room to the pool deck was locked from the inside. The only other exit was the lobby entrance. And the security footage, checked later that night, showed no one leaving after 8:15. By 9 p.m., police officers stood in the same fluorescent-lit space, exchanging low, puzzled conversations while the facility's janitor swore he hadn't seen or heard a thing. The officers checked the showers. Empty. The sauna. Empty. Maintenance closets. Empty. By midnight, the Brookview Community Aquatic Center was sealed off with crime scene tape. Parents were arriving in pajamas and house slippers, voices cracking as they shouted names into the echoing space. The pool water reflected it all. The flash of police lights through the glass windows, the movement of uniforms, the press of frantic bodies. But the surface remained calm. That was the last night anyone saw them. September 3rd, 2024. Location: Brookview, Oregon. Brookview Aquatic Center. It had been 19 years since the locker room was sealed. 19 years since 5 middle school swimmers walked into the Brookview Aquatic Center on a Thursday afternoon and never came out. On the morning the crew began draining the pool, Detective Maureen Coyle stood at the glass doors, staring at the water's flat turquoise surface. She wasn't from Brookview. She had no personal history with the case, no classmates among the vanished, no place in the grainy photos that had hung for years in the town library's missing display. But she had been a rookie in Portland when the story first broke, and she remembered the way every station's news anchor had said the same thing. They were last seen heading into the locker room. No footprints led out. No cameras caught them leaving. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and looked through the condensation to where two workers in rubber boots waded into the shallow end, the surface lowering inch by inch. The sound was constant, the churn of pumps, the gurgle of hoses feeding into a rust-colored storm drain outside. Chlorine hung thick in the air, but beneath it was something else, something the decades hadn't erased. The town's maintenance department had called it a routine structural inspection, but Coyle knew better. This was a planned disturbance. The first time the building had been touched since the day the police tape went up. By 9 a.m., a third of the water was gone, exposing the white slope of the deep end. Stains bled down from the drain covers like rust-colored tears. A few crumpled swim caps clung to the shallow end's floor, brittle from years underwater. She turned at the sound of footsteps. It was Glenn Hawthorne, the town's police chief, a man with a handshake like sandpaper and the posture of someone who'd been answering the same questions for decades. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes looked like they'd been awake all night. "Thought you'd want to see it firsthand," he said, stopping beside her. She nodded toward the receding water. "You're not expecting to find them down there?" "No," Hawthorne said. "But the new owners want to reopen the building. They can't do that with the rumors still alive." "They're not rumors," she said quietly. He didn't answer. By late morning, the pool was half empty. The smell of mildew rose from the exposed tile. A worker slipped on the wet slope, his boots scuffing a patch of the floor where a faint outline lingered. A footprint, distorted but still human. He swore softly, then moved on. Coyle walked the perimeter, her eyes tracing every bolt and seam in the structure. The locker room doors were still chained and padlocked, the same way they'd been on the day of the disappearance. A paper notice, edges curling with age, hung on the door frame. "Do not enter. Evidence sealed." She could feel the weight of the silence inside that room. At 1:14 p.m., one of the crew shouted from the deep end. He was pointing toward the far corner where the tile met the floor. Coyle stepped closer and saw it. A hairline crack in the tile, no wider than a fingernail. Water still trickled through it, dark and sluggish, feeding into something below. "Was that in the old reports?" she asked Hawthorne. He shook his head. "That wasn't there before." The crew brought in floodlights and a pry bar. The sound of metal on tile echoed in the empty space, sharp and irregular. Chunks of grout broke away, revealing a rectangular seam, a hatch cover bolted shut. Coyle crouched beside it. The bolts were corroded but not rusted through. Whoever had sealed it hadn't been in a hurry. The chief was watching her closely. "What are you thinking?" She didn't answer immediately. The hum of the pumps filled the space, and the water line kept lowering, inch by inch. She was thinking about the footprint, about the missing swimmers' folded clothes left behind in their lockers, about the single eyewitness who had claimed to hear muffled voices hours after the pool closed that night. "I think," she said finally, "this is where we stop calling it an accident." By 4 p.m., the hatch was exposed, the last of the water sluicing past its edges. The crew paused, waiting for instruction. Coyle glanced toward the chained locker room doors. 19 years they had been locked. 19 years of dust gathering in the vents, of whispers in the town about what had happened inside. And now here was a hatch no one remembered, hidden just beneath their feet. She looked back at Hawthorne. "We open it tomorrow," she said. He frowned. "Why wait?" "Because," she said, "whatever's down there has been waiting for almost 2 decades. It's not going anywhere overnight." She turned and walked toward the exit, but she couldn't help glancing back at the drained pool. The hatch glistened under the floodlights, water beading on its surface like sweat. For the first time since she'd arrived, Coyle felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Something in this building had been breathing all these years. They just hadn't heard it yet. September 4th, 2024. Location: Brookview, Oregon. Brookview Aquatic Center. The morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to sag under its own weight. Detective Marin Coyle drove in with her headlights still on, windshield wipers pushing aside a fine, stubborn mist. Brookview's streets were quiet. Kids were in school. The joggers and dog walkers stuck to covered porches. By the time she parked outside the aquatic center, the building's parking lot was slick with rain. The smell of wet asphalt and old chlorine met her as soon as she stepped out. The front doors were propped open with a bucket, and the hum of industrial fans drifted into the damp air. Chief Hawthorne was already inside, standing by the drained pool with his arms folded. The floodlights from the day before were still trained on the deep end, their glare making the hatch glisten like a coin at the bottom of a well. "They brought in a structural engineer from Salem," Hawthorne said when she joined him. "He's worried the bolts might snap." "They're coming out one way or another," Coyle said. Two crew members in coveralls knelt beside the hatch. One was working a drill, its whine sharp against the cavernous silence. The other kept brushing water from the surface, revealing the full outline. A rectangle about 4 feet by 3, set flush into the tile. The bolts were darker than the surrounding metal, the heads eaten slightly at the edges. As she watched, the drill bit slipped with a metallic clank. The man cursed under his breath and reset the tool. The sound of the rain on the roof above was constant, a steady percussion. Coyle found herself glancing toward the locker room doors again. The chains hung limp but solid, the paper evidence notice still in place. She'd requested the key from evidence storage the night before, but part of her wasn't ready to touch those doors yet. The first bolt came free at 9:42 a.m. The engineer marked it down in a notebook, then stepped back to let the crew work the next one. They moved clockwise, each bolt loosening with a reluctant groan. By the time the fourth was removed, the hatch's corners began to shift under the pressure of the wet air beneath. A faint odor escaped, metallic, faintly sweet, with the undercurrent of mildew. Coyle crouched beside it. "Smell that?" The engineer nodded. "Old water, maybe storage space, maybe crawl space." She tapped the metal surface lightly. It rang hollow. When the last bolt was free, 2 crowbars slid under the edge. The hatch lifted slowly, the hinges stiff but not seized. A sigh of air escaped, warmer than the room, carrying with it a smell that wasn't just mildew now. There was something else, something that clung to the throat. The floodlights angled down, catching on concrete walls and a vertical steel ladder leading into the dark. The space below wasn't flooded, but it wasn't dry either. The floor glistened faintly in the beam. "How far down?" Hawthorne asked. 8 feet, the engineer said, peering in. "No more." The ladder looked stable. Still, Coyle insisted on a safety line before anyone went in. They clipped it to her harness. She took a flashlight, pulled on gloves, and started down. The rungs were damp, cold enough to sting through the leather. Halfway down, the smell thickened. Old water, rust, and something faintly organic, like soil that had been sealed away too long. Her boots met the floor with a shallow splash. The water pooled only an inch deep here, but the sound echoed unnaturally in the confined space. The walls were bare concrete, streaked with mineral stains. She swept her beam left, then right. On the far wall, an iron door stood half-recessed into the concrete. No markings, no handle, only a keyhole, corroded but intact. "Hawthorne," she called up. "You're going to want to see this." By the time the chief joined her, the air felt heavier. He studied the door, his expression unreadable. "Key and evidence?" she asked. "Nothing like this on record," he said. They examined the seam. Whoever had installed it had done so with precision. The frame sat flush, no obvious prying points. The corrosion told its own story. This had been here long before the pool was drained 19 years ago. Coyle tried the key from her own ring just to be sure. None fit. "We can cut it," one of the crew offered from above. "Not yet," Coyle said. Her beam caught something in the shallow water near the base of the wall, a pale shape no bigger than her palm. She knelt, reaching in carefully, and pulled it out. It was a swim tag, laminated, its cord brittle with age. The number printed on it was faint, but still legible. 47. Hawthorne exhaled slowly. Those were from the old system. Before the renovation, kids would hand them in for their locker keys. Coyle turned the tag over in her hand. The laminate was clouded, but there was a small smudge inside, something darker pressed against the paper backing. She recognized it instantly. A faint half-moon, like a child's thumbnail pressed too hard into the surface. The rain on the roof deepened to a steady drumbeat. Coyle stood, slipping the tag into an evidence bag. "We cut that door," she said. "Today." The crew brought down a portable grinder. The sound was deafening in the small space, sparks spitting against the wet floor. The air turned metallic, the smell mingling with the must of the sealed chamber. When the blade finally bit through the last section, the door shifted inward with a low groan. The smell that came out was older than anything in the pool above. A stagnant, sour odor that seemed to sink into the skin. The beam of Coyle's flashlight revealed the start of a narrow hallway, its floor uneven, sloping slightly downward. The concrete here was darker, the walls sweating with condensation. She stepped inside. The hallway ended after 12 feet in another door, this one wooden, the surface swollen and cracked. The faded remnants of a painted sign clung to its center. "Girls' locker room, staff only." She froze. The aquatic center's blueprints didn't show any sub-level locker rooms. Hawthorne's voice was quiet behind her. "You think they built over it?" Coyle didn't answer. She was staring at the edges of the door, where the wood had bowed just enough to leave a dark slit. Cold air seeped through, brushing her skin. Something about that draft was wrong. It wasn't just cold. It moved in steady, rhythmic pulses, like the exhale of something alive. September 4th, 2024. Location, Brookview, Oregon. Brookview. Aquatic Center sublevel. The wooden door was older than the concrete surrounding it. The grain ran in swollen, uneven ridges, and the hinges were a kind of brass that had long since turned black. Detective Maren Coyle stood just shy of touching it, the flashlight beam sweeping across the faded letters. The paint was chipped, but the words were still there, stubborn in their defiance of time. Girls' locker room. Staff only. Above, the muffled sounds of movement filtered down from the drained pool. The work crew had stayed topside, their voices occasionally echoing through the hatch. Down here, those echoes didn't sound like voices at all. They warped into something distant, layered, like sound underwater. Chief Hawthorne rested one hand on the concrete wall. "I'm calling this in before we move." Coyle nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the narrow slit between the warped planks. The draft that pulsed through it was strange, colder than the room they were in, but not the kind of chill from stagnant air. It carried a faint tang of something mineral, almost metallic, with an undercurrent that made her stomach tighten. When Hawthorne finished his radio call, they set up the portable floodlight. The harsh white glare filled the space, cutting into the shadows that clung to the corners. The wooden door looked even more out of place under that light, a relic of a different building, a different time. The first hit from the battering ram splintered the frame with a muffled crack. The second widened the gap enough for the draft to become a low, steady whistle. On the third, the hinges groaned, then gave. The door swung inward with a wet sound, like pulling something loose from the bottom of a lake. The smell rolled out in a dense wave. It wasn't the immediate rot of something fresh. but the lingering, deep-set odor of a space that had been sealed with organic decay for years. Marin swallowed against the tightening in her throat. Her flashlight swept the room beyond. The beam cut across rows of wooden benches, the old kind, with chipped varnish and rusting brackets. Against the far wall, a line of lockers stood crooked, their doors warped open like yawning mouths. The tile floor was slick, reflecting the light in broken patches. In some spots, water still pooled, the ripples shifting from their movement in the doorway. Coyle stepped in first, careful with her footing. Her gloves brushed the edge of a bench, and the wood gave slightly under the pressure, soft with age and damp. She passed the first row of lockers, their metal hinges whispering faintly as if reacting to the shift in air. "Jesus," Hawthorne muttered behind her. She turned her light to where he was looking. On the wall between the second and third rows of lockers, a row of hooks jutted out. Hanging from them were 5 faded towels. They were stiff, brittle, the fabric clinging to the shape it had dried in. But they were spaced evenly, as if placed there deliberately, side by side. The colors were dulled, but each was different. One pale blue, one yellow, one striped, one solid white, one with a cartoon seahorse faded almost to nothing. Coyle didn't touch them. At the base of the hooks, a small wicker basket sat tipped on its side. Inside were 3 swimming goggles, children's size, the elastic band stiff, the lenses clouded. The silence pressed in again, so complete she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She turned toward the back of the room. Beyond the last row of lockers, the space narrowed into a corridor. The light from her flashlight caught something metallic at the end. Another door, this one smaller, flush with the wall. Unlike the warped wood they'd just broken, this one was steel. A simple twist handle sat at chest height, and beside it, stenciled in flaking white paint, were the numbers. 2.7. She tried the handle. It turned halfway before stopping. Not locked, just jammed. She pressed her shoulder into it, and the seal broke with a sound that made the hair on her arms rise. The door opened into a narrow chamber, barely wider than a hallway. Along one wall were 3 metal benches, each bolted to the floor. Opposite them, a single shelf ran the length of the space, about 4 feet high. On the shelf sat a row of mesh bags, 5 in total. Each was labeled with a laminated tag, the ink faint but still legible. Number 44, number 45, number 46, number 47, number 48. Coyle's stomach tightened. The tag she'd found in the water outside, number 47, was missing from this set. Inside each bag was a pair of small sandals, a folded t-shirt, and a pair of shorts. The colors were faded, but the arrangement was meticulous, as if someone had been waiting for the owners to return. Hawthorne stepped in behind her. His voice was low, steady. "Those numbers match the old locker assignments." She glanced at him. "You think these belong to—" "I don't think," he cut in. "I know. I was here in 2005. I remember those kids' families, 5 of them. They were all wearing swim tags in that range." The air in the chamber was colder, the draft from somewhere unseen still brushing past them. She followed it with her flashlight beam toward the far end of the shelf, where the wall met the floor in a line that wasn't quite straight. She crouched. The baseboard here was a different material, a strip of lighter concrete with hairline cracks. She pressed her gloved fingers against it and felt the faint, hollow give beneath. Her eyes met Hawthorne's. "There's space back there." They backed out, calling for the crew. It took less than 10 minutes for a pry bar to split the seam. The baseboard came away in one uneven piece, revealing a black opening about 2 feet high. The draft poured out stronger now, carrying that same mineral smell. Coyle dropped to one knee, angling her light inside. The beam cut across a narrow crawl space. Dirt floor, low ceiling, wooden support beams running like ribs overhead. In the far corner, something glimmered faintly under a film of dust. She slid inside, the cold biting through her jacket. The glimmer resolved into a small plastic case, the kind used for disposable underwater cameras. The latch was stiff, but she pried it open. Inside was a single undeveloped film canister. She turned it over in her hand. On the black plastic surface, written in faded silver marker, were the numbers 9/14/05, the day the 5 children had vanished. September 5th, 2024. Location, Brookview Police Department. Evidence Processing Lab. The film canister sat in the center of the stainless steel table like something toxic. It wasn't large, barely the size of Maren Coyle's thumb, but it carried the weight of 19 years in its lightless interior. She didn't touch it again. She just stood there, arms folded, watching as the evidence technician finished logging the chain of custody. The lab smelled faintly of disinfectant and warmed plastic. Outside the glass partition, the station moved in its usual rhythm. Phones ringing, doors opening, officers passing in and out with folders and coffee. But in here, the air was still, careful. "You know we can't rush this," the tech said. His name was Alan, a quiet man who'd been with the department longer than she had. His eyes flicked from her to the canister, then back. "Film this old, it's fragile. One wrong exposure to light and—" "It's all gone," she finished for him. He nodded, his gloved hands steady as he began to set up the small development tank. "We'll do this in darkness, not even the safe light, process it in low-temp chemicals. But I'm telling you, 19 years is pushing it. Could be nothing but fog." Maren didn't answer. She was already picturing what might be inside. Not in detail, not yet, but in shape and tone. Kids in swim gear, the tiled walls of the pool, maybe a blurred hand in front of the lens. She forced herself to stop. Expectation was a dangerous thing in cases like this. Alan disappeared into the dark room. The door closed with a soft click, and the faint smell of developer chemicals began to leak through the seams. Maren stood by the glass, watching the dim outline of his movements. Time stretched. She glanced at the wall clock. 9:42 a.m. She hadn't slept properly since the previous afternoon. The discovery in the sub-level looping in her mind like a film reel with no end. Hawthorne had already called the families of the 5 missing kids, or what remained of those families. Most had moved away. One mother had died in 2018. Another refused to take the call. By 10:10, Alan emerged, carrying a strip of negatives suspended in a frame. Even without magnification, Maren could see that something had survived. Faint images, ghostly in the amber film. But there. "Next step is scanning," Alan said. "We'll clean them, then bring them up on screen." She followed him into the adjacent room, where a flatbed film scanner waited. The machine hummed quietly as he fed the negatives in, frame by frame. Each image blinked onto the monitor in shades of grainy black and white, the edges frayed, the exposure uneven. The first frame was nothing but blur. Movement caught mid-swing, the flash overexposing half the image. The second resolved into the shallow end of the pool. A row of children sat along the edge, feet dangling in the water. Maren's throat tightened. Even under the grain, she could make out the cartoon seahorse towel, the striped one beside it. Alan clicked to the next frame. This one was darker, the flash underpowered. The tiled wall loomed in the background, and in the foreground, a hand, small, wet, outstretched toward the lens. The angle was strange, as if whoever took the picture was half submerged. The fourth frame made her lean in. 5 children, lined up against a wall she didn't recognize. Not the pool wall, not the locker room she'd seen yesterday. The tiles were smaller, darker, and the grout lines were almost black. Each child wore their swimwear, but no towels. Their hair was wet. None of them were smiling. Alan didn't speak, just kept clicking. The fifth frame was darker still. The same wall, same 5 children. But this time, a shadow cut across the left edge. A figure, tall, indistinct, leaning in. The proportions were wrong for a swimmer or lifeguard. The figure's head almost touched the ceiling. The next few frames degraded into streaks and light leaks. Then, abruptly, a frame that was almost entirely black except for a narrow vertical slit of light. Through that slit, the curve of a face, an eye, wide open, catching the flash. Marin stepped back. That's someone looking in. Alan nodded, his mouth set. Could be the photographer. Could be someone outside a door. The final frame was warped. The emulsion bubbled. But the outline was still clear enough. A steel door with stenciled numbers. 2.7. The same as the one in the sublevel. Marin exhaled slowly. They were in there, at least for some of it. Alan saved the scans to the secure server, tagging each with its frame number. The originals would go into cold storage, but the digital copies were already in her hands. By the time she stepped out of the lab, it was afternoon. The hallway felt different now, as if the air knew it was holding something heavier. Hawthorne was waiting near her desk, a styrofoam cup in his hand. Anything? She handed him the printouts. He flipped through them slowly, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. That wall, he said, tapping the frame with the dark tiles. That's not in the blueprints. You're sure? I was here when the place was built. That's not part of the public areas, and it's not in any of the maintenance records. Then where the hell is it? He didn't answer right away. He was looking at the final frame, the steel door, the painted numbers. If this is all from the same roll, that means the photographer moved from wherever that wall is to the door we found yesterday. Which means they were still alive, Marin finished, at least long enough for someone to bring them back. They stared at the images in silence. Outside the station, the autumn wind rattled the flagpole, the clank carrying faintly through the glass. It wasn't much. A handful of frames, most too damaged to read. But it was the first proof in 19 years that the 5 children had been somewhere other than the pool. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere still within reach of the building. And if that place had never been mapped, it might still exist. September 7th, 2024, location, Brookview City Records Archive, basement level. The city archive smelled like the inside of a paper bag left in the rain. Marin had been here before, but never for anything this far back in the stacks. The overhead fluorescence hummed faintly, giving the rows of shelving a strange pulse, as if the room had its own heartbeat. Hawthorne led the way, a manila folder tucked under his arm, his shoes clicking against the polished concrete. He'd been pacing since they left the station, clearly uneasy about digging into something he'd already sworn years ago didn't exist. At the far end, a clerk named Cheryl waited behind a high counter, surrounded by teetering stacks of files. She was in her late 60s, white hair cut blunt, glasses perched low on her nose. "Police," she said without looking up. "You're here about the old pool permits." "Not just permits," Marin said, sliding her badge across the counter. "We need everything from the original construction. Blueprints, contractor notes, inspection logs, even the change orders. Anything between 2002 and 2005, Cheryl's mouth twisted. "You're lucky the basement wasn't flooded last spring. Half these boxes would have gone." She disappeared through a side door, her footsteps fading, replaced by the faint squeak of a cart. Hawthorne leaned against the counter, tapping the manila folder. "You ever wonder why nobody found that sub-level during the original search?" "I don't think it was on the plans," Marin said. "And if it wasn't on the plans, it's because someone didn't want it to be." Cheryl reappeared with 2 heavy boxes. She set them down with a thud that sent dust blooming into the air. Pool expansion, 2002 to 2005, knock yourselves out. They claimed a corner table. Maren pulled the first box toward her, flipping through rolls of onion skin blueprints held together with brittle rubber bands. The first set showed the public pool exactly as she remembered. 1 main swim area, the shallow end with tiered seating, locker rooms branching east and west. No mention of anything below. The second set, marked revised, October 2003, was more interesting. Near the southwest wall, a notation had been scrubbed out in thick black ink, the kind that seeped into the paper fibers. The erasure was too clean to be accidental. "Someone redacted this," she said. Hawthorne took the sheet, holding it to the light. "Doesn't look like they just changed their mind on the layout. This is deliberate." They moved to the inspection logs. Most were mundane. Water quality checks, electrical clearances, locker room ventilation tests. But in March 2004, a line item caught Maren's attention. Structural reinforcement, southwest wall, sublevel 2. She froze. "Sublevel 2?" Hawthorne was already reading over her shoulder. "There was no sublevel 2. The locker rooms sit at ground level. Underneath is just the pump system and maintenance crawl. Unless they built more." Cheryl passed their table with an armful of folders. "If you're looking for contractor notes, you'll want the Cordray file. They were the primary firm on that job." Maren scribbled the name down. "Where are they now?" "Out of business," Cheryl said without slowing. "Shut down in 2006 after the owner, well, let's just say he had problems." By mid-afternoon, they'd covered the table with paper. Hawthorne spread the blueprints out side by side, matching measurements against the dimensions from yesterday's site visit. The southwest corner didn't line up. There was an extra 7 feet unaccounted for, a space with no official label. "That's big enough for a room," Maren said. "Or a hallway," Hawthorne added. They were still debating when the floor above creaked. It wasn't unusual. The building was old, wood and concrete shifting with the day's humidity. But Maren felt the vibration in her ribs. Cheryl's voice broke the moment. "Found it." She slid a battered folder onto the table. Inside were handwritten notes on yellow legal paper, each sheet signed by someone named W. Cordray. Maren skimmed the entries. Most were typical: supply deliveries, labor schedules. But one, dated June 14, 2004, stopped her. Installed steel door as per specification. No handle on pool side. Key kept in office B until turnover. Hawthorne let out a slow breath. "That's our door." They read on. Later entries mentioned tile work completed in secondary area and plumbing rerouted to avoid main system. Nowhere did it say what the space was for. By the time they packed up, it was past 5. Outside, the sky was the color of steel wool, threatening rain. Maren carried the Cordray file like it was breakable, her mind already arranging the next step. Find surviving crew members, track down Cordray's family, see who remembered what. They didn't speak much on the drive back, the silence heavy with what they now knew. The unknown wall in the photos had been part of a hidden space, built deliberately, sealed deliberately, and omitted from every official record. Somebody had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed that way. September 9th, 2024. Location, Cordray Residence. West Brookview. The Cordray house sat at the end of a street where the asphalt gave up and turned to gravel. Maren parked beneath a leaning maple, its leaves whispering in the late summer wind. The siding was sun-bleached, the porch sagging under the weight of years. She'd called ahead, and the woman who answered, Elaine Cordray, had hesitated for a full 10 seconds before agreeing to talk. That kind of pause told Maren more than any words could. Elaine met them at the door, her hands stuffed into the pockets of a faded cardigan despite the warmth. She had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd outlived more than her share of people. "You were with the police," she asked Hawthorne first, as though Marin's presence was secondary. I was, he said. Now I'm just trying to make sense of some old records. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Family photos covered one wall. Christmases, school graduations, a wedding in the mid-90s. All of them featured the same man, broad-shouldered, dark hair graying at the temples, smiling like he didn't know his future would be marked by ruin. My father didn't talk much about the pool job, Elaine said as she poured coffee into mismatched mugs. When he did, it was always about deadlines and budget overruns. He was proud of the tile work, though, said it was the smoothest finish he'd ever laid. Marin sipped, letting the silence stretch before asking, Do you know why the plans show an unmarked room on the southwest side? Elaine's hand froze halfway to her cup. He told you about that? Not exactly, Marin said. We found it in his notes. Steel door. No handle on one side. Elaine set her cup down. He wasn't supposed to take that job. Said yes anyway because we needed the money. But it wasn't the city paying him for that part. It was a private arrangement. Who? Hawthorne asked. She shook her head. He never told me a name. Just that some man came into his office with an envelope full of cash. Said the space had to be built exactly to spec. No questions, no paper trail. My dad called it the bonus room. Marin leaned forward. And the key? Elaine stared into her coffee. He kept it in his desk until the day after the kids disappeared. Then it was gone. The room felt smaller. Rain had started against the windows, a slow tapping that made Marin's skin prickle. Elaine, she said carefully, did your father ever go back there after the job was finished? Her lips pressed together, color draining from her cheeks. Once, late at night. I remember because I was still awake and I heard his truck. He came in an hour later, smelling like chlorine. He didn't say a word, just sat in the kitchen with the lights off. I think he was crying. Marin felt the hair on her arms rise. Do you know what happened to him in 2006? The papers said he had problems. Elaine's gaze shifted to the rain-streaked glass. He stopped sleeping, said someone was watching the house. He kept the basement locked. One morning I found him sitting down there in the dark, holding that same key. He wouldn't tell me why, just kept saying, I didn't know they'd still be in there. Hawthorne's voice was low. Still be in there. That's all he ever said. The rest of the conversation wandered into safer territory, but Marin kept circling back to that line. Still be in there. It meant her theory wasn't just possible. It was probable. When they finally left, Elaine pressed a small cardboard box into Marin's hands. These were his things after he died. Maybe they'll help you. Back in the car, Marin opened it. Inside were a cracked tape measure, a brass key with no markings, and a water-warped envelope containing a single Polaroid. The image was blurry, but she could make out tile walls, the glint of a metal door, and something dark on the floor just at the edge of the frame. It looked like fabric. Hawthorne said nothing as he started the engine. They both knew they were going to the pool tonight. September 9th, 2024. Late evening location, Brookview Municipal Pool. The parking lot was empty when they pulled in, the sodium lamps casting cones of orange light on cracked asphalt. The pool complex loomed like a relic. Brick walls darkened with mildew, chain-link fencing sagging at the corners. Hawthorne killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the cooling motor and the faint chirp of crickets filled the silence. You sure you want to do this tonight? He asked. Marin glanced at the cardboard box in her lap. The brass key, the Polaroid, the warped envelope. If we wait, someone might get here before us. Someone who doesn't want us opening that door. They went in through the side gate, its padlock still clipped shut but hanging loose in the hasp. Someone had cut it recently. Hawthorne gave her a look but didn't comment. The air inside the pool building was heavy, damp, carrying the chemical tang of chlorine. Echoes traveled strangely in here, bouncing off tile and metal. Their footsteps sounded like they belonged to someone else, somewhere deeper in the building. They passed the empty pool basin first, a blue pit with a skim of rainwater at the deep end, its once bright tiles dull under the emergency lights. Maren could almost hear phantom splashes, the shriek of kids cannonballing into the water. The locker room door was just where it had always been, at the far end of the corridor. Thick steel, painted municipal beige, a heavy bolt, and a handle polished by decades of use. Except tonight, the handle didn't turn. "It's locked," Hawthorne murmured. Maren reached into the box and took out the brass key. It slid into the lock as though it had been waiting. The bolt clicked, echoing too loudly in the tiled corridor. Inside, the locker room was dark. Their flashlights caught the edges of dented lockers, benches with flaking varnish, and a ceiling vent hanging crooked from its screws. The smell here was different. Stale, like the air had been trapped too long. Maren scanned the southwest wall, matching it against the Polaroid in her mind. There, behind a row of lockers bolted together, the outline of a second door was just visible. Hawthorne ran his hand along the metal. "This isn't on any of the official plans." "Help me move them," she said. The lockers shrieked across the tile, revealing the same steel door from the Polaroid. No handle, just a keyhole. Maren's pulse thundered in her ears as she slid the brass key into it. This time, it resisted. She turned harder. Something gave with a grinding snap, and the door shifted inward an inch, releasing a draft of air so cold it felt wet. Hawthorne aimed his flashlight through the gap. "God!" Maren stepped closer. The beam fell on a narrow room, tile walls, a drain in the center, and a single bench bolted to the floor. The air was thick with mildew, but beneath it was another smell, metallic and sour. In the corner lay a pile of fabric, dark, heavy, water-stained. Maren crouched, her gloved hand trembling as she lifted a fold. It wasn't fabric at all. It was clothing, children's clothing, still damp, decades later. Behind her, Hawthorne's light froze on something etched into the tile above the bench. Words, scratched deep with something sharp. "We tried to get out." The sound that followed wasn't from them. It came from somewhere deeper in the dark. A faint, deliberate scrape. September 9th, 2024. Late evening location. Brookview Municipal Pool. Locker room sub-level. For a moment, they both froze. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate drag, as though something heavy was being shifted across tile. Maren angled her flashlight toward the far corner. Nothing moved. The beam caught only glistening patches of mildew and a few rust-colored streaks running down the wall from an old pipe. "You heard that?" Hawthorne whispered. "I heard it," she replied. Her own voice sounded too loud in the damp space. The door yawned behind them, open just enough to show the edge of the locker room beyond. The ordinary world felt impossibly far away. Maren stepped into the hidden room, her boots splashing slightly in the thin layer of stagnant water pooled near the drain. She kept the beam steady, moving it from the pile of children's clothes to the bench, to the wall where the words were carved. "We tried to get out." Her eyes lingered on the last word. The lines cut deeper, almost frantic, as though the writer's hand had pressed until the tools snapped. "Look here," Hawthorne said, crouching at the drain. The grate was corroded but still in place. Through the gaps, she saw blackness, not the shallow void of plumbing, but something deeper. "Give me the pry bar," she said. It took effort, but the grate came loose with a screech that set her teeth on edge. The smell that rose up was far worse than mildew, stale air that hadn't moved in years, tinged with something metallic and old. She shined her light down. The beam caught the outline of a narrow tunnel, just big enough for a person to crawl through. Concrete walls, moisture glistening on the surface. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. This isn't drainage. This was built to connect somewhere. A third sound broke the air then, not scraping, but the faint echo of water dripping far away. irregular and uneven, as if falling from different heights. They looked at each other. No words passed, but the decision was already made. Hawthorne clipped a rope from his kit to the edge of the drain and lowered himself feet first into the hole. His boots touched the bottom, only a 6-foot drop, and he swung his flashlight forward. "Tunnel goes both ways," he called up. "Left heads toward the main pool, right. No idea." Marin followed, the cold air closing around her as she landed beside him. The walls felt damp to the touch, and the sound of their breathing seemed unnaturally loud. They chose right. The tunnel sloped gently downward, the concrete rough under their hands. After maybe 30 yards, the passage widened into a low chamber. Their light swept over the space and froze on what sat against the far wall. A row of metal folding chairs, each facing forward. On each chair sat a glass jar. Inside each jar was an object wrapped in black fabric. Some were small enough to be held in one hand. Marin approached the nearest jar, her heart thudding in her throat. She peeled the damp cloth back just far enough to glimpse what lay beneath. A shoe, a child's shoe, white leather gone gray with age. The size matched an 8-year-old's foot. Hawthorne had already unwrapped another. A pair of swimming goggles, straps brittle, lenses clouded. They didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the slow, steady drip from the ceiling. Finally, Marin turned her light toward the far wall and saw another set of words scratched deep into the concrete. 5 left, 5 kept. Her stomach turned cold. The scrape came again, this time not from behind them, but from somewhere above. September 10th, 2024, 12:04 a.m. Location, Brookview Municipal Pool, substructure access. The scraping above them stopped as abruptly as it began. In the hollow quiet, Marin could hear her own pulse in her ears, fast and heavy. Hawthorne tilted his head back, sweeping his flashlight upward. The beam caught rough concrete, a low ceiling with a jagged outline at its center. "A hatch," he murmured. It wasn't flush. A thin line of darkness framed the slab, and moisture seeped down one corner, dripping onto the chair beneath. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in years," Marin said, but her voice betrayed the doubt she felt. Hawthorne tried the edge with his fingers. Not sealed, just wedged in tight. They worked in silence, their gloves scraping against the concrete, until the slab shifted with a dry, granular hiss. A rush of colder air slipped through the gap, air that didn't smell like the tunnel. "Ready?" Hawthorne asked. Marin nodded. Together they heaved the slab upward. It pivoted awkwardly, resting on some kind of rusted hinge, and revealed darkness beyond. Hawthorne went first, pulling himself up and through. His boots disappeared, followed by his legs, and then the light from his flashlight swung away. Marin followed, her palms scraping on the rough edge as she hoisted herself into the new space. The air was colder here, and there was a faint hum. Mechanical, steady, like a distant pump. They were in a narrow crawl space, wooden beams overhead, the scent of chlorine, faint but distinct. Hawthorne pointed ahead. That way. They crawled, knees and palms pressing into damp wood. The boards creaked under their weight, and twice Marin felt them give slightly, the void beneath suggesting open air. The hum grew louder, and then they saw light, a pale, wavering glow spilling through a slat in the boards. Hawthorne reached it first, lowering himself to peer through. His breath caught. Marin leaned beside him. Below them lay the main pool, drained, the white basin stained with age. And in the center, a rectangle of something darker. The tiles around it had been cut away in a rough square, exposing an opening large enough for a person to slip through. Someone had been working there recently. Tools lay scattered nearby, a pry bar, a cordless drill, a bucket of debris. Fresh dust coated the surrounding floor. "Someone's been digging up the old access," Hawthorne whispered. "But why here?" As if in answer, a figure stepped into view. The man moved slowly, his head turning in deliberate arcs as though listening for something. He wore a faded maintenance uniform, the sleeves rolled up, and in his gloved hands he carried a bundle wrapped in black cloth. Marin's stomach clenched. The man crouched by the opening in the pool floor and lowered the bundle inside. When he stood again, he stayed still for a long moment, looking at nothing, listening, before walking toward the far exit. "Do you know him?" Hawthorne asked. Marin shook her head. "But he's not supposed to be here." They waited until the man disappeared into the shadowed hallway before easing back from the slat. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "We're not the only ones looking for whatever's under this place." Marin glanced back the way they'd come. The jars, the writing, the hatch in the tunnel. All of it felt like pieces of a picture that was just starting to take shape. And now, somewhere in the drained pool below, another bundle had joined the others. September 10th, 2024, 4:42 a.m. Location: Brookview Municipal Pool, Main Basin. The pool's basin looked different in the early hours. The thin light from the emergency fixtures painted the walls in a dull amber wash, and the absence of water made everything feel wrong, like the skeleton of something that should have been alive. Marin stood at the deep end, boots on dry tile, staring at the rough cut in the basin floor. The edges were chipped, the concrete beneath jagged. A ladder leaned against the cutout, its rungs stained by years of moisture. Hawthorne knelt beside the opening, gloves dusted in pale grit. Still fresh. Whoever did this, it was within the last week. The smell was stronger here. The same metallic tang from the tunnel, mixed with something sharper. They climbed down. The narrow cavity below felt like the reverse of the drained basin above. Tighter, closer, with no echo. The walls were raw concrete, damp to the touch. The black bundle lay where the man had placed it. Hawthorne crouched beside it, fingers resting on the knot in the cloth. "Could be dangerous," he said. Marin nodded, but she didn't tell him to stop. The knot came loose under his hands. The fabric sagged, and the contents shifted with a muted, irregular clink. Inside were glass jars, 5 of them, all sealed. Each held something suspended in cloudy liquid. At first, the shapes were indistinct. Then Marin saw the colors, pale yellow, dark brown, a faint greenish cast, and realized they weren't just debris. They were organic. One jar held a strip of cloth folded neatly, edges frayed. Another contained a bracelet woven from thin cord. The third was filled with teeth. Her throat tightened. "Personal effects, or trophies," Hawthorne said. The 4th jar was worse. The shape inside unmistakably human, though small. A finger bone, the nail still faintly visible. The 5th jar was empty except for a slip of paper, its ink bled to a blue haze. Hawthorne tilted it toward the light. Letters emerged, shaky but deliberate. 5 first names, the same names carved in the tunnel. The sound of movement above made them both freeze. Footsteps on the basin tiles, slow, paused, then started again. Hawthorne placed the jars back in the cloth and pulled the knot tight. "We can't be here when he comes back." They climbed out in silence, their breaths loud in the stale air. By the time they reached the edge of the basin, the footsteps had stopped. The man in the faded maintenance uniform was standing at the far end. His head was tilted slightly, as though weighing whether they were real or just something imagined in the long hours before dawn. Then he smiled, a small, knowing thing, and walked away without a word. September 10th, 2024, 6:13 a.m. Location: Brookview Municipal Pool, Service Corridor. The hallway smelled of mildew and cleaning agents, a chemical fog trapped between decades-old walls. Marin's flashlight swept over peeling paint, exposed wiring, and the faded stencils of old maintenance instructions. Hawthorne moved ahead with the bundle clutched under one arm. The jars clinked softly despite his care, each sound sharp in the stillness. "He wanted us to see him," Maren whispered. Hawthorne didn't answer. His pace was steady, but the set of his shoulders was different now, tighter, more contained. The service corridor led to a stairwell that descended deeper than Maren expected. The air cooled as they went, and the hum of machinery grew louder. At the bottom, the concrete opened into a long room lined with lockers, older than the main ones upstairs, their paint chipped and metal warped. Some stood open, revealing dust and discarded uniforms. Others were sealed with rusted locks. "This isn't on any of the current floor plans," Hawthorne said, running his fingers over a dented locker door. Maren glanced at the floor. Footprints, faint but visible in the dust, led toward the far end of the row. They followed. The prints stopped at a section of wall where the paint was a different shade, as if replaced. Hawthorne pressed his palm to it. Hollow. It took them both to move the panel. Behind it was another door, wood with a corroded handle. No lock. The room beyond was small, no more than 8 feet square. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, its light dim and jaundiced. In the center sat a metal chair. On it, a neatly folded set of children's swim clothes. Beside them, a pair of goggles, the elastic brittle with age. Maren's breath caught. She recognized the pattern on the trunks, blue with faded white stripes. She had seen them once before, in a photograph clipped to the original police report. Hawthorne unwrapped the bundle, setting the jars on the floor in a row. The names on the slip of paper matched the initials sewn into the trunks. "This is where he brought them," Hawthorne said quietly, after they were gone from the locker room. Maren felt the weight of the air in the room, heavy with the sense that nothing here had been disturbed for years. Until now. From somewhere deeper in the building came the sound of a latch closing, then the deliberate creak of footsteps, growing nearer. Hawthorne's eyes flicked to the door. "We can't get caught down here." But the steps stopped just outside. The shadow under the door frame shifted. And then a voice spoke, low and calm. "You're late." September 10th, 2024, 6:24 a.m. Location, Brookview Municipal Pool. Sub-basement room. The voice was right outside the door. Calm, almost conversational, but edged with the certainty of someone who'd been expecting them. Maren's pulse kicked against her throat. Hawthorne set the last jar back in the bundle, his movements deliberate, quiet. They stood side by side, both staring at the door. The knob didn't turn. The man on the other side didn't knock. He just spoke again. "I've been waiting for someone to take them." Maren forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" Silence stretched for a moment. Then, someone who remembers, someone who stayed. The knob rattled once, a test. Hawthorne took a step toward the door. "We're with the investigation. We know about the tunnel. We know about the names." A laugh, soft and low, like air leaking from a tire. "Names don't matter. They weren't supposed to leave." The door opened an inch, then another. The man stood in the dim hallway, the same faded maintenance uniform hanging loose on his frame. His hair was white, his eyes pale and sharp in the gloom. "You found the jars," he said. Hawthorne's voice was steady. "Tell us what happened." The man leaned against the frame, as if the story were heavy. It was supposed to be safe. That morning, the storm knocked the power out. The lifeguards didn't come in. The kids, they stayed in the water, playing. Nobody noticed when they slipped away. He looked past them at the small room, at the chair, at the folded trunks. They were down here. I was told to keep them until it was time, but nobody ever came back for them. Maren's skin went cold. How long were they alive down here? He met her eyes. Long enough to know they'd been forgotten. The air seemed to press in. Hawthorne shifted his weight, his hand brushing the wall as though steadying himself. "Who told you to keep them?" The man's gaze drifted. "It doesn't matter now. They're all gone. The water took them back." He stepped backward into the hall, the movement slow, almost measured. "You shouldn't stay down here. The drain lines, they're waking again." Before either of them could move, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Hawthorne exhaled, a sharp sound in the small room. "We're not letting him leave." They followed, moving quickly through the service corridor, past the locker rows toward the stairwell. The lights above flickered as they climbed, the hum of the machinery deepening to a low, resonant thrum. By the time they reached the drained basin, the man was gone. The only sound was the echo of water somewhere far below, slipping through pipes that hadn't been used in years. Myron looked back toward the tunnel entrance. She thought she saw movement, a small shape just at the edge of the dark, standing in ankle-deep water. Then it was gone. September 17th, 2024, 4:42 p.m. Location: Brookview Police Department. Evidence archive. The jars sat on the evidence table, their glass clouded, the paper labels curling at the edges. Each name had been cross-referenced with the original disappearance file. 5 initials. 5 children who never came home. Myron stood in the archive room, the air cool and still. Hawthorne leaned over the table, his gloved hand hovering just above the nearest jar. "Forensics says the contents match chlorinated water from the old deep-end filter system," he said quietly. "That filter line hasn't been connected since '92. "They were kept alive down there," Myron murmured. "And then someone flushed the system." Neither of them said the word. The maintenance man had not been seen again. No security camera caught him leaving the building. His last known address had been abandoned for decades. Officially, the case file would remain open. Unofficially, there was nothing left to find, except the space under the pool, the narrow room with the metal chair, and the slow sound of water moving where it shouldn't. Myron signed the chain of custody log, her pen scratching against the paper. She felt the weight of the basement still pressing against her, the image of the small shape in the tunnel fixed in her mind. As she left the archive, she paused in the hallway. Somewhere in the building, faint and almost indistinct, came the muffled echo of children's laughter. She told herself it was just an old pipe shifting in the walls, but she didn't look back.